What's up, guys? My name is Stephen Guadagni, 5 Tool Sports Science, right here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We got a good video coming for you today. We're going to be talking about enhancing pitching velocity and reducing injury through hip to shoulder separation. Okay. All right. So let's define it. What is hip to shoulder separation? So the definition of hip to shoulder separation is the angular difference between the pelvis and torso during pitching. Typically measured at front foot contact, it reflects the disassociation between hip rotation and trunk rotation. Here's a video, or here's at least a picture of it. Pelvis line, trunk line. In golf, they call this the X factor because how it creates that X position there, okay? And because it's also a pretty key correlation to a lot of, rotational movements in sports. Hip to shoulder separation just plays a big role. Okay, so the separation creates a rubber band effect, storing elastic energy in the obliques, the core, and the trunk muscles that can be released and decreased to increase trunk rotation velocity and ball speed. So the hips rotate toward home plate while the torso remains delayed and closed, creating the separation angle. In golf, they call it the X factor. Okay, so what's going to happen? You come to leg lift your peak knee height. You start to drift and pick up energy down the mound, the linear movement, okay? You're loading into the back leg, okay? You start to initiate the pelvic rotation. The pelvis is going to create the angular velocity, the rotational velocity, and then you're also gaining linear momentum because your gravity is moving towards the mound. You're using some ground force to create some linear propulsion, okay? Hit front foot strike. The pelvis is opening. The shoulders are delayed, remaining closed, okay? And that's what's creating the rubber band effect. That's what's creating the stretch through the obliques, through the core, through the trunk. So by the time you're hitting front foot strike, the pelvis is opened, the pelvis has led the energy, the trunk remains closed, and you've created this hip to shoulder separation. And when you draw lines through these positions, you're gonna create some degree of separation, which we're gonna talk about in this video, okay? So that should cover a pretty good explanation of what's happening in the delivery to get you to the point of hip to shoulder separation. Now, moving forward. Okay, so why does hip to shoulder separation matter? Greater max hip shoulder separation is moderately correlated with higher pitching velocity by enabling greater trunk rotation velocity. So what this basically means is more is not always better. It's moderately correlated with ball velocity. I think in pitching before, we used to just kind of preach like we just need more hip to shoulder separation. So I was guilty of this. So we just need more hip to shoulder separation, more hip to shoulder separation. Well, that's not necessarily true. All right. There's length tension relationship. There's the guy's unique anatomy and physiology and motor control and movement preferences. It's not always more is better. Okay, depending on the individual, okay, some guys might create a ton of hip to shoulder separation, some guys might create smaller amounts of hip to shoulder separation. But what we are finding is high velocity pitchers tend to have some degree of hip to shoulder separation, okay? So, next point, it's command and energy efficiency. Poor separation leads to early torso rotation, which we've covered at length in other videos, but let's talk about it briefly again. Early torso rotation is going back to when we're talking about hip to shoulder separation. What can happen is instead of delaying the trunk rotation and landing close and creating some degree of separation in the upper half, you're landing open, the glove side or your torso is early rotating open. You're losing all of that stretch, all right? And you're landing in a more open position. And then everything kind of rotates together. The hips and the trunk kind of rotate together. You're not creating that stretch, all right? So that leads to increased arm stress that actually raises torques in the arm. It creates energy leaks, which is going to make you not throw the ball as hard, and it creates more command issues. Typically, those guys with those early torso rotations, you start to miss the ball arm side high, or you yank the ball across glove side, okay? So it starts to create all kinds of command issues. All right, which it throws off the direction. Okay, so injury prevention. Proper sequencing reduces undue stress on the shoulder and elbow by optimizing kinetic chain timing. Again, we've covered this at length of just the importance of the trunk landing closed is going to put stress upon or reduce stress upon the elbow. The more that we land open, we're actually raising the stress on the elbow, okay? So hip to shoulder separation at foot contact predicts peak trunk rotation velocity, which in turn predicts pitch velocity. Another thing that we've covered at length in some of our other videos is just how much the trunk and the core and trunk rotation velocity and trunk power is correlating to pitching velocity. All right, so the more separation at front foot contact, by the time you're landing in the ground, this amount of hip to shoulder separation that you can hold into front foot strike, all right, is going to help you with your trunk rotation velocity. Trunk rotation velocity, we know in turn, is predictive of pitch velocity. We did another video looking at a study where they found for every 10% increase in trunk angular velocity, so how fast your trunk is rotating. Okay, so how fast your trunk is rotating, that 10% increase in trunk velocity equated to about a 5% increase in ball velocity jump. That's really big, okay? Um, I think there was another one that saw 100 degrees per second of increase in your trunk angular velocity equated to about 1 mile per hour, okay? So there is some correlation of how fast your trunk is rotating to your pitching velocity. Okay, so ideal mechanics and timing. Optimal range of separation. This is again going back to the variance between player to player. Most high velocity pitchers exhibit hip to shoulder separation between 25 and 50 degrees, with some outliers above 55 degrees. All right, so if we're looking at professional pitchers, okay, you're going to see some guys that aren't going to be getting a ton of stretch in their upper body. Think of guys like Spencer Strider, Shohei Ohtani. I don't think that they're getting some maximal amount of hip to shoulder separation. Then you look at a guy like Aroldis Chapman or Camilo Doval and these like massive amounts of hip to shoulder separation, okay? So there is a lot of variance into how much degrees of separation you are landing with, and that's very individual to the player. Okay, timing. The timing is to reach max separation at front foot contact, then rapidly close the gap through trunk rotation to transfer energy efficiently. So let's talk about this again. Some things that you're going to see when a guy's like coming to his leg lift, he starts to load and gather, and the arm starts to load back. A big common thing that you can see is guys reach their maximum amount of hip to shoulder separation, but they're nowhere near front foot strike. All right, so they've created all this separation. You've counter rotated the trunk into this big separation, and then the front foot is nowhere near the ground, so there's no tension, there's no torque. And so what happens is by the time you get to front foot strike, you've lost all that separation. All right, so that's a big part of the timing. The timing needs to be your max separation at front foot contact. That's the hard part of this. The hard part of this is timing and sequencing and coordinating the movement to where when you hit front foot strike and you're landing here, you've timed your peak separation right at that moment. That's the key. That's the really, really hard part of the timing and the sequencing. A lot of the times you see guys, they can get to the positions, they just have it very mistimed. All right, that's a very common flaw. Okay, sequencing order. Pelvis initiates rotation. Pelvis initiates rotation. Then you go to peak pelvis velocity, then your trunk rotation, peak trunk rotation velocity, and then your arm accelerates into ball release. This is called the summation of speed principle, with each segment building off the last segment. So if we look at this light green line is going to be the pelvis. This is going to be the trunk. The arm isn't in this one, but it's like each peak builds off the next. So here's the pelvis rotation. There's its peak right there. There's the trunk rotation. There's its peak. It peaks higher, and then the arm would peak higher, and then it would go into ball release. So each segment is passing its energy to the next segment, and the next segment is peaking higher. That's the summation of speed principle. This clean sequencing effect of passing energy through the hips, right, through your pelvis, to your trunk, to the arm, is the summation of speed. Passing energy from the hips to the trunk to the arm, okay? Biomechanical efficiency, proper hip to shoulder separation allows eccentric loading of obliques, enhancing concentric trunk rotation velocity, the stretch shortening cycle. So again, we've talked about this, but it's just that stretch, the stretch of landing at front foot strike is creating a stretch. I like to talk about it like a diagonal line, like from your foot, drawing a line all the way up to your arm is creating a huge stretch in your obliques and in your core, all the way up to where now you've got this rubber band stretch. And then when you go to fire, it concentrically goes and it snaps everything through. So there's an eccentric loading of everything. And then by the time that front foot is hitting the ground and everything's stretched, is now it all fires, okay? That's the stretch shortening cycle. Okay. Common breakdowns, early torso rotation. We talked about that. That's the front shoulder flying open, early trunk rotation. Insufficient hip rotation. We covered this in a video, a great study that Brittany Dowling did on talking about open and closed pelvic positions in professional players and how open pelvis pitchers were tending to throw the ball harder with less stress. So insufficient hip rotation can definitely be a cause of poor hip to shoulder separation. Inability to disassociate hips and shoulders. Again, that can be a timing issue, that can be a mobility issue, that can be a speed, strength, power issue. That's where getting assessed really comes into play. But a lot of guys, they just have a disconnect in how to get their hips and their shoulders to separate specifically into front foot contact. Energy leaks. If the pelvis fails to block or decelerate effectively at front foot contact, energy leaks, increasing shoulder and elbow stress. So this is talking about the front leg. What we're basically meaning here. Here's the separation. The pelvis has created some sort of acceleration. There's the linear aspect of it, and now whether we're talking about like a guy creating drive off of the mound with the knee extension or the pelvis internally rotating, whatever drive leg style you're talking about, what we're talking about is the back leg controlling your center of mass, creating some sort of linear propulsion, as well as creating some internal rotation of the hip, some angular velocity through the pelvis. So hopefully you are landing with a more open pelvis position at front foot strike. Now that, again, that's variable from guy to guy. Shohei Ohtani does not land with a very open pelvis position. Other guys do land with a more open pelvis position, okay? But now we're talking about the front leg. Okay, so you're landed closed, you're in your stretch. Say you did all of this like great. You've passed energy through your pelvis, you've accelerated, you've peaked your angular velocity of your pelvis, you're landing closed, you're landing stretch. The energy can still dissipate if this front leg gives out on you. This front leg needs to be strong, stop the forward momentum, create the deceleration, okay? So that now you have a strong, stable base in the pelvis. The pelvis isn't moving forward anymore. It's become strong and stable that the trunk has something to whip and rotate off of. I like to call this slamming the door. I've given the illustration of you've got a doorway, say you've got your door frame, that door frame isn't moving anywhere. You've got the door on a hinge, okay? Think of it like that. The pelvis is the door frame, it's stopped, okay? Your door has opened somewhat, and now it's going to slam closed, okay? All right, so some of the corrections that we can work on is emphasizing relaxed hip rotation, co-contraction in the back hip, and improving timing rather than aggressive hip firing. So I think this is where coaching is evolving a little bit for training and pitchers. Is we used to just like really emphasize like the firing of your hip rotation and driving through the mound and just powering this hip rotation. And a lot of the times I think we can almost get better results if you are just teaching how to load into that backside enough, teaching how to backwards chain a little bit, which is like get your shoulder position and your arm position in the right place at first. And then if you organize everything correctly, you're going to give yourself the best chance to get a clean rotational energy transfer. So again, going back to the timing, there's a study, I think it's Mac Williams in like 1998, where it was looking at the ground reaction forces, and these massive impulses of telling a guy to push off of the mound was actually destroying the timing. So you can do more harm than good in trying to really coach up the back leg. There's almost, in my opinion, there's almost more of a relaxation into hip rotation. You see a lot of professional guys talk about this right now, where the pelvis is just moving underneath them. It's not some huge drive leg concerted effort. That being said, there's still variance, guys. Like we still have to keep into account. There's guys that have like Tim Lincecum, Spencer Strider, Shane McClanahan, all guys that talk about the back leg drive and driving off of the mound and creating a lot of ground reaction force to create extension. Okay, so it's not just ruling it out, but there does seem to be that guys who learn to rotate the hips under them without really driving through the mound, it might be a more effective way to learn how to orientate the pelvis and learn the timing of it. Then once you've learned the timing of it, you might be able to add on a little bit more violence and some of that linear propulsion, okay? Co-contraction in the back hip. I think that's great with isometric type exercises. Anything that where, like, I like to take a weight stack, like a 210-pound weight stack, get a training bar. You're using the training bar, load that thing all the way up to 210 pounds, load yourself out so where you can't move that weight, but you're pushing into that mound as hard as you can. And when you push into the mound as hard as you can, you should feel the glute contract, your the front of the hip flexors contract, the side glute med contract. Everything is just contracting. Your adductors contracting. That's the co-contraction, the total contraction of the hip. Guys who can co-contract better control that back leg better. They're going to be able to ride the mound longer. So the co-contraction, they'll be able to ride and like hold the mound longer, okay, because they're creating friction against the mound, okay? They're holding that back leg torsion and load position. They're winding everything up in that hip, and then that's going to create the snap of that hip rotation, okay? So the co-contraction emphasis in the back hip, that you can work on that in your strength and conditioning. You can work on that in some feel type drills in your pitching mechanics training, okay? And then improving timing rather than the aggressive hip firing. We touched briefly on that. It's not so much like this aggressive hip firing. It's just being able to time the rotation into front foot strike more efficiently, okay? All right, so strength and mobility, address hip and internal rotation deficits in terms of mobility, and trunk mobility to reduce compensations and injury risk. So some of the issues that you can run into is poor hip internal rotation, poor hip flexion. So hip internal rotation is going to be the hip doing this, then the hip extension is going to be an extension of the hip. If you have poor mobility in either of those ranges, it's going to be hard for you to land with the more open pelvis position. And then trunk rotation, I like to think of it what people talk about like the spinal engine theory, and we're looking at the trunk in all three planes of motion, where we're looking at the transverse, the sagittal, and the frontal plane. Okay, so you've got like your side and lateral tilt, you've got your trunk rotation, and then you've got your extension. So if we're going here, extension and flexion of the trunk. Okay, so improving your spine mobility, improving your hip mobility is going to help you create more hip to shoulder separation. So mobility assessments, if you're at home, I use a motion capture machine. I can measure and look at, all of these stuff that we're talking about, the thoracic mobility, hip internal rotation, every measurement that we want. But if you're at home, you can easily test this. You can do a seated trunk rotation test with your hips and knees at 90 degrees. So that's just sitting. And then you just put something in between, like a foam roller in between. I like to use just a little bit of like a PVC pipe. You're sitting down and then you just rotate your trunk as far as you can. If you have bad thoracic rotation, it's going to limit your ability to create hip to shoulder separation. So thoracic rotation is just this, your trunk rotating in the transverse plane, okay? Hip range of motion. So in one study, they found differences in stance versus lead hip internal rotation correlate with greater hip to shoulder separation and pitching velocity. So they were looking at the internal rotation of your back leg and in your front leg. And when you didn't have enough sufficient hip internal rotation in either leg, that was affecting your ability to create hip to shoulder separation and pitching velocity, okay? Pitchers with limited hip or trunk range of motion or small hip to trunk range of motion ratios should undergo biomechanical assessment to identify deficits and should be reassessed frequently. Again, you don't need, if you have the biomechanics way to do it, that's great. If you just have somebody that knows how to do some sort of functional movement screen using goniometers to look at hip internal rotation, external rotation, all of those type of measurements, all of your trunk mobility measurements, you should be able to get a good understanding if you have mobility issues keeping you from hip to shoulder separation. All right. Reduced mobility can limit the ability to create and utilize hip to shoulder separation, decreasing velocity and increasing injury risk. Drills and training that you should be doing for it. Okay, drills for sequencing and feel. Plyo ball throws. I think one of the best things about weighted balls, plyo ball throws, it's not the arm speed or arm strength that you think that you're gaining from it. It's the ability to have proprioception, to understand where your arm is at in space and feel these deeper ranges of motion and create better mechanics and movement. So it's a great drill for sequencing and feel versus just trying to build arm strength or arm rotation or arm speed, okay? Water bags are a great way to build it, both in deceleration of the front leg, of delaying the trunk rotation or creating some sort of disassociation in the drill, of using the weight of the water bag as the weight of the water bag is going forward and your hips or sorry, the weight of the water bag is going back and your hips are going forward. It's a great way to create some disassociation between the pelvis and the trunk. Um, Med ball drills, another great way that you can train the trunk rotation, the timing, and yeah, those are some of my big ones. Okay, so then throwing drills to transfer hip to shoulder separation, that feel of that into throwing. Okay, strength and mobility, incorporate rotational exercises with cables, flywheels, Proteus motion if you have it, hip internal rotation strengthening, and thoracic mobility exercises to support separation in your mechanics. Combine mobility, strength, and throwing drills into a cohesive routine for rotational power sequencing and maximal transfer to the field. So the main idea is you're taking all of these things and adding it into a single training plan based off of the individual, what he needs to work on. Some guys might need to work more on the speed, strength, power side. Some guys might need to work more on the mobility. Some guys might need to work more on the timing and the drill work side to build the disassociation and build the timing into front foot strike. It all becomes extremely individual to the player. Okay, so summary and practical application, hip to shoulder separation is a key biomechanical factor that enhances pitching velocity and efficient kinetic sequencing. Optimal separation involves a balance of not just the maximal angle of separation, but well-timed creation, near front foot contact, and rapid closure to transfer energy, okay? Poor separation mechanics increase injury risk through early dorsal rotation and energy leaks. Regular mobility screening and biomechanical assessments help identify deficits and guide individualized training. Use targeted drills emphasizing hip trunk disassociation, relaxation, and sequencing. All right, so I hope that gave you guys a pretty comprehensive overflow of hip to shoulder separation, how you can work on it, the importance of it, and some of the key things that are important for training hip to shoulder separation and some of the common myths that surround it. And here's a list of some of the studies that we used in making this video. So I hope this was informative for you guys, and hope you guys stay tuned for the next one. All right, have a good one.